Hi, my name is Rise. I'm a developer at Sparkbox, and today I'll be talking to you about progressive enhancement. If you're here, chances are you work in tech, which means you probably know how to turn off JavaScript in your browser. Have you ever turned off JavaScript, then forgotten to turn it back on again, and then you visited a website and thought, wait, is my internet broken? Is this website broken? Nothing works. Maybe some of your buttons don't respond or your forms don't submit. Maybe the content doesn't even load at all without any indication that it's because there's no JavaScript. And maybe eventually you realize that all of this is happening because you forgot to turn JavaScript back on, but not before sending a Slack message to your colleagues. This is Catherine, by the way, in this Slack message. She's one of our technical directors and she's awesome. And after you send that Slack message to your colleagues, maybe you'll do it all over again a couple of years later. These kinds of, oh no, something's broken moments are often brought to you by experiencing something on the web that isn't progressively enhanced. This is something that could happen if you've forgotten that you turned off JavaScript, but it could also happen because of your connection or browser or for a number of other reasons. And if we, as developers and other web-focused people, can be thrown off by that experience, imagine how confusing it can be for users who have no idea what JavaScript is in the first place. That's why today I want to talk about how we can build progressively enhanced experiences, even in a JavaScript-heavy world. First, what is progressive enhancement? Progressive enhancement is the idea that your website should focus on your core content and functionality first and foremost, then use CSS and JavaScript to enhance that core experience. The idea behind this is that if something fails or doesn't work as intended along the way, we can fall back to something that still works. So in other words, progressive enhancement delivers a functional baseline of content to all users, then enhances that experience for those with modern browsers and better capabilities. So now that we know what progressive enhancement is, why does it matter? We want users to have a great experience no matter their device or connection. On the other hand, working in tech, I know many of us often get excited about cool designs and cutting edge tools like React and frameworks. And those things are great, but they only matter if users can actually do what they came to your site to do. That's why we need a fallback to a core experience that still works when your site can't be experienced as you intended. And to talk about things that don't work as intended, there are many potential obstacles when it comes to whether or not your user can experience your website the way that you intended them to. They might be on an older device with an older browser that doesn't support some of the features that more modern browsers typically do. They might be on a mobile device. I know we've all had experiences where the website is the same, but just smaller for mobile, which makes it so that you can't see everything without horizontally scrolling, or you can't tap on things properly because they're so tiny. Maybe your user has a poor connection, which might be even likelier if they're on their mobile device. And one more obstacle that sometimes people overlook is that users might require assistive technologies. There is a whole world of technologies out there beyond just screen readers and keyboard navigation. There are so many different types of assistive technology out there that users might prefer or require. So that's another way that your user might not be experiencing your site the way that you intended them to. All of this is a lot to try to account for when you're building a website, but we can still achieve that with progressive enhancement and find a happy medium between the cool features and supporting all users and how they might use your website. A progressively enhanced experience is one that is built in layers so that we're building on a solid foundation that includes basic content and function. And then each layer on top of that adds value so that if something breaks, the user is missing maybe a layer or part of a layer rather than missing the full experience. This also makes it so that we don't necessarily have to think about a fallback for every specific thing on a website that might not go as we expected it to. So I mentioned that we build progressively enhanced experiences in layers. The first layer, or the foundation, when we talk about progressive enhancement on the web, is content, which should consist of HTML. And for that reason, it's really important to use semantic HTML. Just using appropriate heading levels, for instance, will give your page some basic styling and structure before any additional styles are applied to it. The second layer is the presentation layer, or our CSS, which styles and customizes the HTML elements. CSS also lets us adapt layouts based on screen size. Since small screens can limit how much content or interface we can show at once, it's important to design thoughtfully for that experience. At Sparkbox, we like to use the mobile-first approach, so we can prioritize the mobile experience where space is more constrained before we scale up to larger screens. The last layer is JavaScript, which will add interactivity to the page. This layer should enhance the core experience instead of replacing it. However, in many client-rendered React apps, JavaScript controls interactivity and also the HTML and styles, so that if JavaScript fails, the page might not render at all, which makes JavaScript more of a requirement and less of the intended enhancement in those cases. So we've talked about what progressive enhancement is, why it matters, and the layers that it consists of. Now I want to share some practical tips for building progressively enhanced sites, especially in the age of frameworks. Tools like React are really powerful. Not only do they offer more organization than their predecessors, as John mentioned, but they also allow us to combine markup, styling, and interactivity in one place. On the other hand, that can also make it difficult to separate those layers. I know lots of us might love frameworks. I know for me, that was how I learned web development, but luckily we've come a long way and we have lots of options now. My first tip is don't inject core content with JavaScript. If you have to fetch content or you have important content, try to do that on the server. Be wary of using useEffect for fetching content because it will do so after the component has mounted. But since it doesn't run until after the page is loaded in the browser, that content won't be rendered until after JavaScript kicks in. Instead, there are React frameworks now that support fetching content on the server with either get server-side props or other functions that allow fetching on the server, or frameworks that offer server components. My next tip is pick the right tool for the job. You heard this in the previous talk, and as Dustin mentioned earlier, it's not always worthwhile to rewrite your projects and switch everything, but if you're starting from scratch, take time to experiment and be thoughtful about the tool you choose. Sometimes simple HTML and CSS with a bit of JavaScript sprinkled in will work, but other times you'll need more. We've got this helpful flowchart that we're sharing out for picking the right framework. John also talked about React rendering strategies in his talk and has a great article that breaks down some of the rendering strategies and when to use them. So those are all different things that you can use to help pick the right tool for the job. There isn't a one-size-fits-all tool, and that's great because the web is so diverse and we do need those options. Here, we've grouped some of our frameworks by how naturally they support progressive enhancement. Tools like Astro, 11D, Quick, and HTMX are what we're calling friendly. Astro and 11D start with static HTML and let you layer in JavaScript enhancements. So you're starting with a solid foundation by default. Dustin previously mentioned that Astro uses islands architecture, which gives you some control over when to use JavaScript. Quick is great because it's designed around resumability. So it sends working HTML that becomes interactive without full hydration. HTMX enhances existing HTML with simple attributes, keeping your baseline experience functional and robust. And then we have frameworks like Next.js and Remix. We call those capable. These give you tools to be more deliberate about what runs in the browser and when. They prioritize server-rendered HTML and provide components that work without JavaScript, but enhance when it's available. They do require more intentional architectural choices to truly support progressive enhancement, though. And as Dustin mentioned, there can be a performance cost when components render on the server and then also again on the client. Not every framework is quite as helpful, though. So React, Vue, and Angular are challenging because they can support progressive enhancement, but it takes a lot more effort. And then there are some frameworks that were designed exclusively for client-side interactivity. So supporting non-JavaScript users often means building parallel solutions, which might mean maintaining two different approaches. And then there are some setups that make progressive enhancement nearly impossible. These examples depend completely on JavaScript to work. Modern frameworks fall on a spectrum. So friendly ones make progressive enhancement more of a default, while capable ones will support it with effort. And your choice might depend on the needs of your website or web app, as John and Dustin alluded to earlier. Depending on what your needs are, it's true that there are some experiences that are impossible or nearly impossible without JavaScript, and that's not a bad thing. React was created because Facebook was trying to power a highly dynamic UI, which wouldn't have worked without JavaScript. If that's the case for you also, say so. Let your users know that they need JavaScript if it's turned off. Even then, they should need JavaScript only for the parts of your site that require it. For example, if your user wants to read an article, they don't need JavaScript, but it could enhance the experience. If your user wants to buy anything, even if they can't check out, they should still be able to browse products. An e-commerce site shouldn't be completely broken without JavaScript. My next tip relates to that foundational HTML layer I talked about. Use semantic HTML and use it correctly. Semantic HTML elements carry meaning and often come with built-in behaviors, so use those when possible instead of reaching for a div for everything. There are lots of fun native HTML elements now, like details and summary for disclosure widgets and dialogue for modals. Using semantic HTML will shape your content and can give it fallback styling even without CSS. It also improves how your content behaves when it's experienced in unexpected ways. Take, for example, screen readers. There are many of them, and it's hard to test them all, but using semantic HTML gives those screen readers consistent cues on how to interpret your content. The same goes for users who use the browser's reading mode. Your content will be formatted in a more expected way if you use those semantic tags. And for SEO, semantic HTML is also a huge help. Search engines rely on HTML structure to figure out what matters on a page. Using landmarks such as main and using proper headings will help give them the context that they need. I also have a tip for our presentation layer. Write CSS in a progressively enhanced way. So there are a few things that you can do here. As I mentioned earlier, writing mobile-first CSS is a way to ensure that your design works well on smaller screens before scaling up. You can also make your CSS more progressively enhanced by using a font stack so that if your primary web font doesn't load, there's a fallback. It's also helpful to keep in mind that CSS can handle some interactivity and animations, but do be cautious since some interactions that use CSS rather than JavaScript might not always be the most accessible depending on what you're trying to do. And then also just be aware that there are some progressive enhancement drawbacks to using CSS and JS. I know it tends to be pretty popular because if JavaScript fails, then you lose the JavaScript and then you also lose the CSS. You can also consider a feature detection tool like Modernizer to provide fallbacks for unsupported features, but its usage has declined a little bit in recent years. I think what I tend to see more commonly is checking browser support for CSS features and then aiming to use those that are widely available. My last tip is to test for all of the things. Obviously, you can't test for everything. You probably already know that. And I'm sure that your organization already does some testing because it is valuable, even though it does have its limitations. If you haven't looked at how you're testing your work in a while, it is worth reevaluating. I've noticed in the teams that I've worked on that if we test within PRs, that's often done with a PR review checklist, which is often baked into our pull request template. And then after a while, developers tend to start ignoring that checklist because they think it's outdated or just doesn't apply. And they're maybe also not even sure whose responsibility it is to be checking things off. If any of that sounds familiar, that's probably a sign to revisit what you're testing. Maybe talk about why it's important or whose responsibility it should be, or refine when those things apply and when they don't. As far as what you should test, though, that's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Your organization should decide collectively what's worth prioritizing based on the purpose of your app and your user base, and then test every feature or PR against that set of test cases. And of course, all of that is subject to change depending on the situation. Here are some ideas, though, for what you can test. Some should definitely be familiar. So you can disable JavaScript or throttle your connection just to see what it looks like. You can check different browsers or devices. So Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, maybe Opera. Think about testing a physical mobile device or an emulator. So not just a mobile-sized screen, since behaviors on a touch screen can be a little bit different. You can check Windows high contrast mode also to accommodate users who might need that feature. We have a design systems client that's pretty intentional about this because the styles are very custom. So we use the Force Colors media feature in CSS to set some of those styles, and not all of them need to always be set. High contrast mode does do a decent job of picking colors on its own, but it's not always perfect. You can view Windows high contrast mode on a Windows machine, but you can also emulate it in Chrome or Edge. It's under Force Colors in the DevTools rendering tab. Likewise, you can test with a screen reader for those users who might be using one. But if you can't, do follow accessibility guidelines. And if even that feels daunting or your team doesn't have the expertise to know what they're looking for in terms of accessibility, there are tons of automated tools out there like Lighthouse or Axe. We've actually tested a bunch of these at Sparkbox and written Foundry articles about them over the years. So you could integrate this into your CI if you haven't already. There are also lots of other automated tools, not just for accessibility, but also for performance and SEO. Using those, of course, won't catch everything, but might catch some glaring issues on your website. And all of those checks do relate to progressive enhancement in some way because they help to ensure that your user is getting the best possible experience, regardless of their device, connection, or abilities. Even something like sustainability checks contribute to progressive enhancement as well. So for example, you can run your site against something like EcoGrader to check the carbon footprint of your website. And there's a correlation there too. If your site is really resource intensive, it's probably not going to do so great for a user who has a poor connection because it's loading so many resources. Finally, it's always great to test with users too. So UserBrain, usertesting.com, and Optimal are great tools for this. And UserBrain particularly can accommodate smaller budgets. So all of those were some practical ways to try to incorporate progressive enhancement into your website where possible. But through all of that, it's important to keep in mind the idea of progressive enhancement. Ideally, no matter the circumstance, your user shouldn't experience anything that seems really broken. Even if they're not getting every enhancement, they should get something that works. If one of our layers fails, for instance, if JavaScript fails, or styles don't load, or some dependency hiccups, the core experience should still be there. Progressive enhancement isn't about holding back, but instead it's about ensuring that we build resilient and reliable foundations so that a wide range of users is able to use your site, even if they like to turn off JavaScript and occasionally forget to turn it back on again. Thank you.